9 biblical signs that God is teaching you spiritual wisdom. There are seasons in life when knowledge alone no longer feels sufficient. You may understand many things, yet something deeper begins to grow within you. You start to see beyond appearances, to perceive meaning beneath events, and to recognize patterns within your own inner life. This is not simply learning, it is the beginning of wisdom. Spiritual wisdom does not arrive suddenly. It forms gradually, often through experience, reflection, and quiet transformation. God does not only teach through answers, He teaches through life itself. Situations become lessons, waiting becomes understanding, and even difficulty becomes formation. Wisdom grows when the heart begins to perceive truth beyond surface understanding. You may notice subtle shifts within yourself. You react less quickly and observe more deeply. You begin to understand people, situations, and even your own thoughts with greater clarity. What once felt confusing now reveals meaning. What once felt random now shows direction. This is not coincidence, it is formation. God often teaches wisdom quietly, shaping perception rather than merely providing information. Scripture often presents wisdom not as knowledge alone, but as understanding applied to life. Those who grew in wisdom did not simply know more. They perceived more clearly, responded more steadily, and moved with deeper awareness. Wisdom transforms not only what you think, but how you live. It shapes response, perception, and direction. Today, we will explore 9 biblical signs that reveal when God is teaching you spiritual wisdom. These signs may appear quietly, yet they reflect a profound inner formation taking place within you, strengthening your discernment, clarity, and ability to move through life with deeper understanding. The first sign that God is teaching you spiritual wisdom appears when you begin to observe more than you react. There was a time when many situations triggered immediate response within you. Words were spoken, emotions rose, and your reaction often followed without deep reflection. You felt, responded, and only afterward began to understand what had happened inside you. But gradually, something within you begins to change. The space between what happens and how you respond starts to widen. You begin to notice before reacting, to listen before responding, to perceive before concluding. This shift may feel subtle, yet it marks the beginning of wisdom forming quietly within you. Spiritual wisdom often begins with awareness rather than information. God does not only teach by adding knowledge, He teaches by deepening perception. When awareness grows, reaction becomes slower and understanding becomes deeper. Instead of being carried by immediate emotion, you begin to observe what you feel. Instead of reacting to surface events, you begin to notice patterns beneath them. You start to see connections between experience and growth, between challenge and formation, between reflection and clarity. This transformation reflects the early stage of wisdom, where understanding begins to guide response rather than impulse. There was a season in my own life when I reacted quickly to what I felt, often without truly understanding my own inner movement. Situations came and went, emotions followed, and I moved through life reacting rather than perceiving. I did not realize how much of my life was being shaped by automatic response. But over time, something began to shift quietly within me. I started to notice moments where I could observe before reacting. At first, the change was small, almost invisible, yet it gradually altered how I experienced life. I began to see more clearly, to understand more deeply, and to respond with greater awareness. Looking back, I understand that God was not simply teaching me information. He was forming wisdom within my perception. Scripture often reflects this movement toward watchfulness and deeper understanding. Those who grew in wisdom were described as attentive, perceptive, and steady. They did not react blindly. They perceived quietly and responded thoughtfully. Wisdom does not remove emotion, but it reshapes its influence. Reaction becomes observation, and observation becomes understanding. This transformation strengthens the inner life because response begins to flow from clarity rather than impulse. From a psychological perspective, this transformation reflects increasing self-awareness and reflective thinking. When awareness deepens, the mind becomes less reactive and more observant. You begin to recognize patterns in your thoughts, emotional cycles within your responses, and meaning within your experiences. Instead of reacting automatically, you process consciously. This strengthens resilience because your responses become intentional rather than impulsive. Awareness becomes the foundation of wiser response, allowing you to engage with life rather than simply react to it. You may notice subtle signs of this quiet transformation. You pause more often before responding. You listen more deeply before concluding. You feel less driven by immediate reaction and more guided by inner awareness. Situations that once felt confusing begin to reveal meaning. Your inner life becomes more attentive, more perceptive, more steady. This is not hesitation, it is formation. God is teaching you spiritual wisdom by turning reaction into observation, shaping clarity within your inner life. As this awareness continues to deepen, another quiet transformation begins to unfold. You begin to perceive meaning within experiences that once felt random, and life itself begins to feel more instructive than before. Reflection grows deeper, and understanding begins to emerge naturally. This leads to the next stage of formation, where spiritual wisdom begins to transform experience into understanding and reflection into discernment. Another sign that God is teaching you spiritual wisdom appears when your life experiences begin to feel instructive rather than random. There was a time when many events seemed disconnected, happening without clear meaning. Challenges felt like obstacles, waiting felt like delay, and uncertainty felt like confusion. You moved through situations trying to understand what they meant, often feeling that clarity would only come when circumstances changed. But gradually, something within you begins to shift. You start to perceive that experiences themselves carry lessons. Situations no longer feel meaningless. Even difficulty begins to reveal direction. Spiritual wisdom often grows through reflection on lived experience. God does not only teach through clear answers, He teaches through life itself. Moments of waiting become lessons in patience. Moments of uncertainty become lessons in trust. Moments of difficulty become lessons in resilience. What once felt like interruption begins to feel like formation. You begin to see that nothing is wasted when awareness grows. Each experience contributes to deeper understanding, shaping how you perceive and respond. There was a season in my own life when I felt that many things were happening without clear purpose. I faced uncertainty, confusion, and periods where direction felt unclear. I often wondered why certain moments felt difficult or why clarity seemed delayed. But slowly, through reflection and time, I began to see patterns. Situations that once felt random began to make sense. I realized that many of the experiences I resisted were shaping something deeper within me. I did not gain instant understanding, but I began to perceive meaning within the process. That shift helped me recognize that wisdom was forming quietly through experience. Scripture often reflects this pattern of learning through lived moments. Those who grew in wisdom did not receive understanding only through instruction, but through reflection on experience. Their perception deepened because they observed how life itself revealed truth. Wisdom transforms experience into insight. Instead of reacting to events, you begin to learn from them. Instead of resisting difficulty, you begin to understand what it forms within you. This deepens discernment and strengthens the inner life. From a psychological perspective, this transformation reflects meaning-making and cognitive integration. When reflection increases, the mind begins to organize experience into understanding. Events that once felt chaotic begin to form coherent patterns. This reduces confusion and strengthens clarity. You become more capable of interpreting life rather than feeling overwhelmed by it. This strengthens resilience because experience becomes a source of insight rather than stress. You may notice subtle signs of this transformation. You reflect more on what you experience. Situations begin to feel instructive rather than random. You perceive lessons within difficulty and meaning within waiting. Your understanding deepens naturally. This is not forced interpretation, it is formation. God is teaching you spiritual wisdom by turning experience into understanding and reflection, into insight, shaping deeper perception within your inner life. As this understanding continues to grow, another quiet transformation begins to unfold. You begin to distinguish more clearly between what appears true and what is truly aligned, and your inner life becomes more discerning. This leads to the next stage of formation, where spiritual wisdom begins to develop deeper discernment within your perception. Another sign that God is teaching you spiritual wisdom appears when your discernment begins to deepen, allowing you to perceive beyond appearances. There was a time when things seemed straightforward on the surface. Situations appeared clear, words seemed simple, and decisions felt obvious. Yet often, what appeared true was not always aligned with deeper reality. But gradually, something within you begins to change. You start to sense what lies beneath appearances. You perceive intention behind words, direction beneath events, and alignment beyond surface impressions. This shift reflects the growth of discernment. Spiritual wisdom often expresses itself through discernment rather than certainty. God does not always reveal everything immediately, but He refines perception so that you begin to recognize what is aligned and what is not. Discernment is not judgment, it is clarity. You begin to sense what leads toward growth and what leads toward distraction. This quiet awareness strengthens your inner life because your responses become guided by deeper perception rather than surface reaction. There was a period in my own life when I often relied only on what was visible. I interpreted situations quickly and believed surface understanding was enough. Yet over time, something began to change. I noticed that some things felt different beneath the surface. I began to sense misalignment where I once saw certainty and clarity where I once saw confusion. This did not come suddenly. It formed gradually through reflection, experience, and quiet awareness. Looking back, I understand that God was forming discernment within me, teaching me to perceive beyond appearances. Scripture often reflects this depth of perception. Those who grew in wisdom did not rely solely on outward appearance. They perceived inward alignment. Their strength was not in knowing everything, but in sensing what was true beneath what was visible. Wisdom refines perception, allowing discernment to guide response. Instead of reacting to what appears obvious, you begin to respond according to deeper clarity. From a psychological perspective, this transformation reflects pattern recognition and intuitive processing. As awareness grows, the mind becomes more capable of distinguishing between surface signals and deeper meaning. You begin to recognize subtle cues, emotional undercurrents, and hidden dynamics. This strengthens decision-making because your perception becomes more refined and less reactive. Discernment allows you to navigate complexity with steadiness rather than confusion. You may notice subtle signs of this transformation. You sense alignment or misalignment more quickly. You perceive meaning beneath words and direction beneath events. Your inner clarity grows even when outward situations appear uncertain. This is not suspicion, it is formation. God is teaching you spiritual wisdom by refining your discernment, shaping deeper perception within your inner life. As this discernment continues to deepen, another quiet transformation begins to unfold. You begin to value silence and reflection more than constant reaction, and your inner life becomes more contemplative and grounded. This leads to the next stage of formation, where spiritual wisdom begins to grow through silence and deeper reflection. Another sign that God is teaching you spiritual wisdom appears when you begin to value silence and reflection more than constant reaction. There was a time when noise, movement, and constant engagement filled much of your inner and outer life. You responded quickly, spoke quickly, and often moved from one moment to the next without deep reflection. Yet gradually, something within you begins to change. Silence no longer feels empty, it begins to feel meaningful. Reflection no longer feels like delay, it begins to feel clarifying. You start to sense that understanding grows more deeply in quietness than in constant activity. Spiritual wisdom often develops in stillness. God does not always teach through noise or urgency. He often teaches through quiet awareness. When the inner life slows, perception deepens. Instead of reacting immediately, you begin to reflect. Instead of filling silence, you begin to listen within it. This transformation strengthens clarity because wisdom grows where awareness is undisturbed. Reflection becomes a place of formation rather than hesitation. There was a time in my own life when I avoided silence without realizing it. I filled my thoughts with movement, distraction, and constant engagement, believing clarity would come through activity. Yet over time, something quietly shifted. I began to notice that moments of stillness brought deeper understanding. I started to reflect more, to listen inwardly, and to perceive more clearly. Silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It became meaningful. Looking back, I understand that God was teaching me wisdom through quiet reflection rather than constant reaction. Scripture often reflects this pattern of learning through stillness and contemplation. Those who grew in wisdom were often described as attentive, reflective, and grounded. Their understanding deepened not through haste, but through quiet awareness. Wisdom grows where reflection replaces reaction. Silence becomes a place where perception is refined and understanding emerges naturally. From a psychological perspective, this transformation reflects increased mindfulness and cognitive clarity. When the mind slows, deeper processing becomes possible. Instead of reacting automatically, you begin to think more clearly, feel more steadily, and perceive more deeply. This strengthens resilience because reflection allows thoughtful response rather than impulsive reaction. Silence becomes a space where clarity forms. You may notice subtle signs of this transformation. You feel less need to react immediately. Silence feels calmer rather than empty. Reflection brings clarity rather than confusion. Your inner life becomes more grounded and attentive. This is not withdrawal, it is formation. God is teaching you spiritual wisdom by deepening your reflection, shaping clarity within stillness and awareness within quietness. As this reflective awareness continues to deepen, another quiet transformation begins to unfold. You begin to respond to life with greater balance rather than emotional fluctuation, and your inner life becomes steadier across changing circumstances. This leads to the next stage of formation, where spiritual wisdom begins to shape emotional balance and steady perception. Another sign that God is teaching you spiritual wisdom appears when emotional balance begins to grow within you and your responses become steadier across changing circumstances. There was a time when your inner state shifted easily with what happened around you. When situations were favorable, you felt elevated. When pressure appeared, you felt unsettled. Your emotions often followed external movement, and your responses reflected that fluctuation. But gradually, something within you begins to change. Emotional waves still arise, yet they no longer carry you in the same way. A quieter balance begins to form beneath what you feel. Spiritual wisdom often reveals itself through balance rather than intensity. God does not remove emotion, but He reshapes its influence. You still feel deeply, yet you are less driven by emotional extremes. Instead of reacting according to shifting feeling, you begin to respond from steadiness. This balance allows clarity to remain even when emotions move. Emotional stability becomes a foundation rather than a struggle, and your responses begin to reflect calm awareness rather than fluctuation. There was a season in my own life when emotional fluctuation shaped much of how I responded. When I felt strong, I moved confidently. When uncertainty appeared, I felt unsettled. My inner state often followed what I experienced externally. Yet over time, something began to shift. I noticed that even when emotions moved, I could remain steadier. The feeling did not disappear, but it no longer determined my response. That quiet shift revealed that something deeper was forming within me. God was not removing emotion. He was teaching balance. Scripture often reflects this steady balance as a mark of growing wisdom. Those who matured spiritually were not free from emotion, but they were not ruled by it. Their responses reflected steadiness even in changing seasons. Wisdom transforms emotional fluctuation into emotional balance. Instead of being carried by shifting feelings, the heart remains grounded, allowing clarity to guide response. From a psychological perspective, this transformation reflects emotional regulation and internal equilibrium. When balance strengthens, emotional extremes lose their control. The mind becomes less reactive and more stable. This strengthens resilience because responses are no longer determined by emotional fluctuation. Stability becomes consistent rather than conditional. You may notice subtle signs of this transformation. Emotional waves still arise, yet you remain steadier. You feel less driven by emotional extremes. Your responses feel more balanced and grounded. This is not emotional dullness, it is formation. God is teaching you spiritual wisdom by forming balance within your inner life, shaping steadiness across changing circumstances. As this balance continues to deepen, another quiet transformation begins to unfold. You begin to recognize what truly matters more clearly, and your inner life becomes guided by deeper priorities rather than surface concerns. This leads to the next stage of formation, where spiritual wisdom begins to refine your values and clarify what is truly essential. Another sign that God is teaching you spiritual wisdom appears when your sense of what truly matters begins to clarify from within. There was a time when many concerns felt equally important. Immediate pressures, temporary distractions, and outward expectations often competed for your attention. You moved from one demand to another, sometimes without deeply questioning what truly deserved your energy. But gradually, something within you begins to change. Certain things lose their weight. Some concerns that once felt urgent now feel secondary. A quieter clarity begins to guide your focus toward what is lasting rather than what is temporary. Spiritual wisdom often expresses itself through refined priorities. God does not simply give knowledge. He reshapes what the heart values. When wisdom grows, the difference between what is temporary and what is essential becomes clearer. You begin to invest less energy in what only occupies and more in what strengthens. This does not remove responsibility, but it reorganizes focus. You start to sense what builds your inner life and what merely distracts it. This clarity strengthens direction because response becomes guided by deeper values rather than surface urgency. There was a season in my own life when I followed what seemed expected without deeply examining what truly mattered to me. I moved with the flow, trying to keep up with demands and distractions, believing activity alone meant progress. Yet over time, something quietly shifted. I began to notice that some things left me empty, while others brought clarity and strength. I started to feel drawn toward what deepened rather than what merely occupied. That shift did not happen suddenly, but it changed how I lived. Looking back, I understand that God was refining my priorities, teaching me to see what truly mattered. Scripture often reflects this movement toward deeper alignment of values. Those who grew in wisdom learned to distinguish between the temporary and the lasting. Their strength came not from doing more, but from focusing on what was essential. Wisdom clarifies priorities. It guides the heart toward what strengthens rather than what distracts. When values align with deeper truth, direction becomes clearer and steadiness grows. From a psychological perspective, this transformation reflects value alignment and cognitive clarity. When priorities become clearer, inner conflict decreases. You feel less divided between competing demands and more guided by coherent direction. This strengthens resilience because your responses are shaped by purpose rather than pressure. Clarity of values creates stability within the inner life. You may notice subtle signs of this transformation. Some distractions lose their pull. You feel drawn toward what brings depth and clarity. Your focus becomes more intentional. This is not withdrawal. It is formation. God is teaching you spiritual wisdom by refining what you value, shaping clarity within your priorities and direction within your inner life. As this clarity continues to deepen, the final transformation begins to unfold. You begin to live with quiet understanding rather than constant searching, and your inner life becomes guided by wisdom rather than by uncertainty. This leads to the final sign, where spiritual wisdom reveals its deepest expression within your life. Another sign that God is teaching you spiritual wisdom appears when you begin to understand people with deeper compassion rather than quick judgment. There was a time when you interpreted behavior mainly through surface perception. Actions seemed simple, intentions seemed obvious, and responses formed quickly. But gradually, something within you begins to change. You start to perceive the complexity within people. You recognize hidden struggles behind visible actions, emotional weight beneath words, and human fragility beneath behavior. This shift reflects growing wisdom because perception becomes deeper than appearance. Spiritual wisdom often expresses itself through compassionate understanding. God refines perception so that you begin to see beyond behavior into the inner condition of the heart. This does not remove discernment, but it softens harsh judgment. You begin to respond with steadiness rather than reaction, with understanding rather than assumption. Compassion does not weaken clarity, it deepens it. Wisdom allows you to see both truth and humanity at the same time, strengthening your response and deepening your inner maturity. There was a season in my own life when I reacted quickly to what others did or said, often interpreting situations only through what appeared on the surface. But over time, something began to shift. I began to notice that behind many reactions were struggles I could not see. This awareness softened my responses and deepened my understanding. Looking back, I understand that God was shaping compassion within my perception, forming wisdom through deeper awareness of others. From a psychological perspective, this transformation reflects emotional intelligence and perspective expansion. As perception deepens, you begin to understand motivations, emotional contexts, and hidden pressures more clearly. This reduces reactive judgment and strengthens relational stability. Compassion becomes a sign of wisdom because response becomes grounded rather than reactive. You may notice subtle signs of this transformation. You judge less quickly, you understand more deeply, you respond with steadiness rather than reaction. This is not naivety, it is formation. God is teaching you spiritual wisdom by shaping compassionate understanding within your perception. As this compassionate awareness deepens, another quiet transformation begins to unfold. You begin to trust inner clarity more than external noise. and your life becomes guided by quiet understanding rather than constant searching. Another sign that God is teaching you spiritual wisdom appears when you begin to trust quiet inner clarity more than external noise. There was a time when many voices shaped your direction. Expectations, opinions, pressure, and external influence often guided your decisions. You searched outward for confirmation, believing clarity must come from outside. But gradually, something within you begins to change. You still listen, yet you are less dependent on external voices. A quieter inner clarity begins to guide you. You begin to trust the calm understanding forming within. Spiritual wisdom often leads inward rather than outward. God does not isolate you from the world, but He strengthens inner discernment so that you are not shaped by every external influence. You begin to recognize when something aligns with truth and when it does not. This clarity does not come from impulse, but from quiet perception. Wisdom grows when the inner life becomes grounded enough to perceive without confusion and respond without external pressure. There was a period in my own life when I followed what others expected, unsure of my own direction. I searched outward for certainty, believing answers must come from external confirmation. Yet over time, something quietly shifted. I began to notice a steady inner clarity guiding me. It was not loud, but it was consistent. That shift helped me understand that wisdom was forming within me, not through noise, but through quiet understanding. From a psychological perspective, this transformation reflects internal locus of guidance and cognitive clarity. When inner perception strengthens, dependence on external validation decreases. This strengthens resilience because direction becomes guided by inner coherence rather than external pressure. Wisdom allows the inner voice shaped by reflection and truth to become clearer than surrounding noise. You may notice subtle signs of this transformation. You feel less influenced by external pressure. You trust quiet clarity more than external noise. Your direction feels calmer and more grounded. This is not isolation, it is formation. God is teaching you spiritual wisdom by strengthening inner clarity and guiding your perception from within. The final sign that God is teaching you spiritual wisdom appears when your life begins to be guided by quiet understanding rather than constant searching. There was a time when you felt the need to seek answers everywhere, to understand everything immediately, and to resolve uncertainty before feeling steady. Questions filled your thoughts, and clarity often felt distant, yet gradually something within you has changed. You still seek truth, but you no longer feel restless in the same way. A quieter understanding begins to guide you. You do not know everything, yet you feel more grounded. This is the deeper expression of wisdom forming within you. Spiritual wisdom does not remove questions, but it transforms how you live with them. God often teaches not by giving constant answers, but by forming inner clarity. When wisdom deepens, you begin to live with understanding rather than searching. You perceive more clearly, respond more steadily, and move with deeper awareness. Life feels less chaotic and more meaningful, not because everything is explained, but because your perception has been shaped. Wisdom becomes part of how you see, how you respond, and how you live. There was a season in my own life when I felt internally divided and uncertain about my direction. I did not fully understand where I was going or what I was meant to become. At times I felt lost, emotionally fragile, and unsure of my path. Yet through reflection, prayer, and lived experience, something slowly began to change. I did not suddenly gain all the answers, but I became steadier. I began to understand life more quietly, to respond with more awareness, and to feel less driven by confusion. I am still walking this journey of spiritual and emotional growth, yet I can see how much has changed within me. Looking back, I understand that God was not only teaching me knowledge, He was forming wisdom within me. That quiet transformation continues, and I walk this path together with those who are listening. What you have been experiencing is not random, it is formation. Spiritual wisdom grows gradually, shaping how you perceive, how you respond, and how you live. If you recognize these signs within yourself, then something real has already begun. God often teaches quietly, forming clarity within experience, understanding within reflection, and steadiness within the inner life. This message reflects my personal understanding of Scripture, shaped through life, reflection, struggle, and faith. Like many, I continue learning, growing, and walking this journey. My hope is that this message brings clarity, peace, and deeper understanding to your inner life, helping you recognize that wisdom is already forming within you. If this message spoke to you, take a moment to respond. Write in the comments what you learned, or share a simple declaration such as, "I choose to walk in wisdom and clarity." Your words may encourage someone walking through the same quiet formation.